more and more absurd instances of people being silenced because of alleged hate speech, um, which is not hate speech, but serious criticism of mistaken policies. So when I say that this is a Zeitenwende and we are moving toward a dark age, I think I am not exaggerating.
There's a concept that keeps going through my head. It's this idea that we live in a so-called rules-based order, but that these rules are written by the powerful, interpreted by the powerful, enforced by the powerful, and crucially, they don't apply to the powerful. And I know we have all heard that critic before. It's practically a cliche at this point. But something has changed. Because what we are witnessing now is a paradigm shift. It's leaders saying basically, yes, we are doing it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Trump, for example, is not even pretending, not even dressing it up with legal theater, just raw power. And a kind of gangster logic where the only real law is leverage. And he even parroted a name for it that someone else came up with. Donroe Doctrine. A Mafia version of the Monroe Doctrine, which he dragged back from the grave and repackaged in his latest national security strategy. I've reported on this before. And of course, Trump thinks he is the Don, the Padrino, the guy who runs the whole racket. And that's the point. When the leader of the most powerful state on earth starts talking like a crime boss, it's a signal. It tells the world the rules are gone. And when that happens, something deeper breaks. Not just the UN Charter, not just international norms. What breaks is the psychological contract that holds modern civilization together. The assumption that there is some ceiling, some limit, some shared framework that keeps political violence from sliding back into its oldest form, the strong doing what they want, and the weak absorbing the consequences. Because if international law becomes optional, if due process becomes optional, if sovereignty becomes optional, then reality itself becomes optional. And what replaces it is not order, it's intimidation, it's fear, it's humiliation, and ultimately, it's war. And here's the part that matters for Europe, and for anyone living in a Western democracy actually. When you normalize lawlessness abroad, you don't keep it abroad. It comes home. That's the nature of the beast. Exactly as the so-called battle-tested surveillance and crowd control systems Israel tests on Gaza's population spread around the globe. Only repackaged as innovation, marketed as security, they are quietly plugged into Western's democracies. See, the frontier doesn't stay at the frontier. The methods migrate, the mindset migrates, and eventually the empire imports its own tools of oppression. It comes home as censorship framed as safety. It comes home as social control framed as stability. It comes home as the gradual criminalization of dissent, even in the form of criminalizing your thoughts. And then everyone acts surprised when the very fabric of society starts to decay. This is why I wanted to talk to Ambassador Chas Freeman again. Because Freeman isn't a Twitter pundit. He's not a professional moralizer. He's from the world of statecraft, the world where people actually understand what it means when norms collapse, when deterrence becomes personal ego, and when alliances become rackets rather than security structures. And what he is saying, calm and precise, is basically this. We are watching an epochal transition, a shift away from the entire post-war idea that conflict can be managed through rules, and towards a world where coercion and conflict becomes normal again, where might makes right stops being a cynical description and becomes official policy. So in this conversation, we are going to step back from the daily outrage cycle and we are going to ask the bigger question. What happens to the West and to Europe in particular, when the mask drops, when power stops pretending to follow international law, when the rules-based order turns out to be nothing more than a brand label, and when even allies begin to realize they may no longer be protected, that they are expendable. One last thing, some of my Substack exposés have started finding their way into other publications. The Libertarian Institute has picked up several pieces. Now a Swedish outlet has done the same. And even a senator in Jordan has published what I wrote. To me, that says something important. Despite my Twitter or X account being suspended, despite heavy shadow banning here on YouTube, there's a growing appetite for reporting that is unbiased, unfiltered, and unwilling to simply regurgitate the mainstream script. So I invite you to join my growing community on Substack. Because in an age where perception is engineered and dissent is managed, the most powerful form of resistance is still the oldest one: to look at reality directly and refuse to be told what you're allowed to see. Ambassador Chas Freeman, thank you so much to take for your time today on a Sunday. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm retired, you know. All that means is that you don't get the weekend off.
By persistent, being persistently pursued by people like myself. I know, I know.
Well, anyway, here I am, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. Ambassador, just before we started this recording, you indicated you were not too, how shall I say this, not in a too good mood because of what you just saw and investigated on the internet. Maybe give us a short encapsulation.
Well, as you know, ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, has invaded the city of Minneapolis. There are apparently 2,000 ICE agents there, more now being sent from elsewhere in the country. They greatly outnumber the Minneapolis police force. They have murdered a young woman, a mother, in her car, Renee Good, and a friend of mine, Ted Postal, has just recreated the videos and created slides that show exactly how this incident occurred. And these show beyond a reasonable doubt that the ICE agent was just a murderer. He was in no danger himself. He was uncouth. He was uncivil. He was angry. He was juiced up with adrenaline, and he murdered this woman. The what makes me feel so sad is that there is a ferocious defense of him as having acted illegally and properly by the Trump administration, which is famous for its lies. And this is yet another egregious lie. I think in my country, the United States, the rule of law is under grave assault. It may even have been said to have collapsed. There is a great deal of anger in the public about this. Of course, there are always those who are on the side of violence against immigrants um, and who are willing to excuse the government of its crimes. But I think we really are approaching a pre-revolutionary situation in the United States. The level of disquiet, anger, disgust, rage about the behavior of our government, both domestically and abroad, in Venezuela, for example, is reaching an incandescent level. So I'm not feeling particularly happy.
I can imagine. I followed this close. I followed this case closely, and I completely agree with you. It sounds. I mean, it's unconceivable why this agent shot. I mean, seconds before the shooting, you see the camera from the side. Yeah. There's the body cam from the shooter who passes the car from the side, and the lady was smiling. They had a kind of cordial exchange. Just
She
seconds later,
greeted she
yeah.
greeted him cordially, not sycophantically, but cordially. His last words to her were "fucking bitch."
Yeah.
So this is, in any civilized country, that sort of language by a law enforcement officer would result in discipline. Now it's extolled somehow as representing the philosophy of Stephen Miller and the Trump administration.
Mm. And I think these are signs of what is to come. And I also share your concern here. I mean, from my perspective, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Trump goes in the direction of an authoritarian, how shall we call it, emperor.
No, I think that's not inaccurate. Some people are calling him Trumpigula after Caligula, the insane Roman emperor. It's very unclear that he is sane. He's clearly got a severe case of megalomania, plastering his name on all sorts of things. The Kennedy Center, for example, which has resulted in many artists refusing to play there. The United States Institute of Peace, which he destroyed, it now has the Donald J. Trump sign above United States Institute of Peace. So the man's ego knows no limits. It is the size of a hot air balloon, and it can get to any altitude.
Mm. A lady that I interviewed recently called him the orange man in the White House. I found this somehow fitting. Now,
Well,
before we,
yes, he in an earlier era he had orange hair. Now he's got white hair. He's deteriorating physically and mentally at a very rapid rate. He appears to suffer from dementia. He's unable to uh, utter a coherent sentence, let alone a paragraph. He believes all sorts of ridiculous false things, and his prejudices are entirely open. But the main thing is he has the protection of a virtual cult in much of the Republican Party. And therefore, the normal remedy for the crimes he is committing would be impeachment. But impeachment is impossible given the intimidation of Republican Party members by him and the loyalty of others. So that together, those intimidated and those loyal will block any criticism of Trump whatsoever. This is beginning to break down. We're beginning to see, on the issue of Venezuela, for example, we're beginning to see people break ranks with the cult of Trump, but it is just at a beginning stage.
we will come to Venezuela ambassador. That was actually, you know, a couple of days ago when I approached you, I thought that would be the main focus of our conversation today, but so many things happened, right? Now, if you allow me, I would like to run two documents or policies by you. Let's start with the National Security Strategy from November 2025. Now, before I hand the microphone back to you, me as a linguist, I had a look at this, and there are two words in this national security strategy. Interestingly, the first word is Europe, and the second word is want. I want, we want, the US wants. Yeah. Now, I put you on the spot here. Take a wild guess how often each of those words are in the national security strategy.
I
Wild
really
guess.
have no, I really have no idea,
Yeah.
but I understand what you're getting at.
49 times. By a weird coincidence, both words are exactly 49 times in this document. So the national security strategy is more about Europe than about the US. And if a speaker uses the word want, it says something about the speaker or the writer, because it's not like negotiation or we strive to achieve or whatever. Want means it's kind of a command, right? It's not a negotiation.
No, well, it was obviously, the document was obviously the product of many little minds and not one single author, because it's essentially incoherent and self-contradictory. But
And the style is also the
with
style is
respect to
also
with respect to Europe, um, essentially it foreshadows what is happening, which is an American decision to leave Europe to its own fate, um, except in case of arms sales, where the United States will profit from selling weapons to European countries, so that they can foolishly continue the war in Ukraine. Um, that is the first part of it. The second part of it is the establishment of an essential tyranny in our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, with the first attack in history ever by the United States military on a country in South America, as opposed to the Caribbean and Central America, where we have invaded, occupied, and overthrown regimes on many occasions. There's a history of regime change efforts by covert action in South America, but there has never been anything like the kidnapping of a chief of government or state, the decapitation of a regime, the murder of fishermen on the high seas, the piracy against tankers, all of these in total disregard of the norms of international law and decent behavior. And I think actually, to me, I know the focus is on many details of the Venezuela operation, which was militarily extremely competent and politically totally disastrous. Um, but to me, the significance of this is that it is the end of 3 centuries, beginning with Grotius and others, to create a rules regulated international order. It is very clear that the United States does not, having gone through a phase where we said that we should have a rules based order where the rules are made by us and we decide to whom they apply and to whom they don't apply. And of course, they don't apply to the United States. This was the Biden administration. We've now taken the next step with no rules at all. And Donald J. Trump, our president, openly stating that he has no need of international law and that the only constraint on his behavior is his own sense of morality, which many of us do not find very obvious. So I think this is really, to use the German word, this is truly a Zeitenwende. This is the change of an epoch in history, and it is not in a good direction. And if it is not effectively opposed by governments, as opposed to simply opposed by individuals or groups of citizens who attempt to protest these policies and find those protests suppressed or critics, then I think we are entering a new dark age. And so I will say so tomorrow. I am going to join a conference organized by the Schiller Institute and make some brief remarks, essentially arguing that the time for governments to put up or shut up is upon us. That issues like the Greenland issue, which is now front and center following Venezuela, require more than rhetorical opposition. There needs to be sanctions. There need to be punishments. There need to be consequences for criminal behavior or threats. And I'm sorry to say that as I look at Europe, I see no evidence of anyone standing with Prime Minister Frederiksen in Denmark. She seems to be alone. Some Europeans are doing what Europeans seem to do very well, which is to wring their hands while sitting on them, and nothing beyond that. The only ray of light in all this in Europe is, oddly enough, Giorgia Meloni, who has put forward the common sense observation that if you want to solve a war in Ukraine, you have to talk to the Russians, and which is an insight that apparently has escaped everyone else in Europe. So, and she, I think, is also quite outspoken on the issue of the rule of law internationally, as is the American Pope, Leo. Um, but these are voices in the wilderness, and they're not being joined by others. And I think they need to be. So I will make that argument tomorrow afternoon, your time, morning, my time, at the conference that the Schiller Institute is organizing.
I know the Schiller Institute well. They are very well respected voices in the wilderness. Absolutely. Ambassador, before we move on, one last thing in regards to the national security strategy. The other thing that stood out for me was, of course, the Donroe Doctrine, so a correlation to the Monroe Doctrine. And Donald Trump himself called it the Donroe Doctrine. You would be forgiven to think that he refers to Don as Donald, but I think more he means Don in terms of mafia boss when he states that. Yeah. So
That
a quick
was,
com
sorry,
please.
that was the origin. He didn't invent that, and indeed it did begin as a criticism of behavior worthy of the Godfather, Don Corleone, in the famous film, The Godfather. Donald Trump seems to think that's a compliment.
Indeed. Yeah. Now, if we lay this on the current global situation, so whole of Europe, and I would like to come back to Europe and the reaction to the Ukraine war, yeah? But whole of Europe kind of preached, this was an unprovoked attack, so Russia unprovoked attacked Ukraine, the right of self-determination, etc., etc. And now we have it black and white in the Donroe Doctrine that basically America considers half of the West, also half of the globe, basically their own, right? So what prevents now Putin from, capturing Zelensky from Kiev and then excusing it as, precedent set by Donald Trump?
Well, that precedent has been set. And, in theory, Mexico could object to the flow of guns across the border from the United States, which has turned much of Mexico into an anarchy, and take action to bomb the depots and factories where the guns are kept or made. They could also capture Donald Trump and bring him to trial in Mexico City, in theory, following this precedent. Of course, they won't do that because the whole logic of our time is that might makes right, or perhaps that the rich are now once again free to steal from the poor, whoever they want. Um, I don't think Vladimir Putin needed this precedent to consider doing just what you suggested, namely capturing the residual president, excuse me, of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is, of course, in office beyond his term, and apparently does not see a need for elections. So I think Vladimir Putin is quite capable of that, but I also think he's too smart to do this. I think the United States, by violating international norms as it has put itself in a most unenviable position in terms of its image and reputation internationally. And I don't believe that either the Chinese or the Russians, since the Chinese are also mentioned in this context, will react to this operation in any way whatsoever except to study it as a military model of how to conduct a kidnapping. And that might, under some circumstances, be relevant to both Ukraine and the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War through the taking of Taiwan. But I think both the Russians and Chinese are enjoying watching the United States discredit itself and don't have any desire to emulate us. And that is true of the variety of measures that preceded and accompanied the invasion of Caracas. Uh, that is to say, the murder of people on boats in the near seas of Venezuela, who may or may not have been carrying drugs. If they were carrying drugs, those drugs were headed to Trinidad, from which they do not go to the United States, but go to Western Europe and West Africa. Um, but there's no evidence that any of them were carrying any drugs at all. So this is an entire suspension of every element of due process, no evidence whatsoever, and yet an execution, in this case carried out by the US military. The notion that this operation against Venezuela was somehow a law enforcement operation is also absurd. If you read the indictment of Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, you will find that it is a political polemic with no evidence of any weight at all to support the charges of narco terrorism. The most entertaining, if that's the word, charge in that indictment is that Nicolas Maduro possessed machine guns.
Exactly.
That, which, if he did that, which he probably did, that was in Venezuela, which is not part of the United States, and U.S. law about machine guns is absolutely irrelevant. And I would say that Mr. Maduro, President Maduro, and the First Lady of Venezuela are in a court presided over by a 92-year-old Orthodox Jewish judge with a reputation for rectitude, but also a bit of deference to the government. Nonetheless, I expect this trial to be a gross political embarrassment for the Trump administration, as the various charges it has made to justify what it has done are pulled apart by the defense to Maduro and Flores. So I think the final point here is that this is, of course, not regime change. The regime is still in place. The mainstays of the regime, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, the acting president. Interesting that the regime followed its constitutional succession process, and that in the absence of the legal president, his deputy became the vice president became the president, acting, sworn in that regard. She seems to be playing both sides at once. On the one hand, she has reiterated what Nicolas Maduro was actually communicating before he was snatched, and that is Venezuela would like to have a cooperative relationship with the United States and is prepared to cooperate, and has nothing against the idea of its economy being refloated by American investment. That's the message to Trump, who says to Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president, if you don't do what I say, you will end up worse than Maduro. So this is the classic, as you suggested, Mafia Don approach. She is likely to find a dead horse head in her bed if she does not um, comply. On the other hand, however, she is a Chavista. She is a disciple of Hugo Chavez Frias, the president that the CIA actually arranged to have kidnapped in 2002, 24 years ago. Um, he was deposed. The Venezuelan military then deposed the puppet that the United States installed in his place, and he came back, I think, 2007, as the president of Venezuela with a strong mandate. He died in 2013, was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, and there we are. But Venezuela is following constitutional practices. The United States has totally abandoned all deference to our Constitution, to the rule of law, and so forth. And unfortunately, it turns out that when the most powerful country in the world abandons fidelity to the law, that is contagious to everyone else in the world. I have just heard, for example, that Pascal Lotaz, who is the host of Neutrality Studies, a Swiss scholar resident in Japan, has had his YouTube account suspended for absolutely spurious reasons. Um,
Spam. Yeah, they said
and
it was spam.
so we're living in a world in which freedom of speech, which in a revolutionary manner was guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States in our First Amendment, is under attack at home. And in Europe, there are more and more absurd instances of people being silenced uh, because of alleged hate speech, um, which is not hate speech, but serious criticism of mistaken policies. So when I say that this is a Zeitenwende and we are moving toward a dark age, I think I am not exaggerating.
I had a number of speakers on my channel who were silenced in the literal sense, from academics to journalists. Most recently, I mean, today I published my interview with Patrick Henningsen, an international correspondent and a filmmaker. He tells the story how he was silenced. Patrick Barb, for example, Lothar Pascal from Neutrality Studies. He interviewed me on his channel, as you just said. Apparently his whole English YouTube channel was removed. This kind of thing. So this is really a
Well, there are cases. He is, of course, a Swiss citizen,
living
but
in
so is
Japan, living in Japan even.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, Jacques Beau is also a Swiss citizen,
Exactly,
and he
exactly.
has been
Natalie Yam,
persecuted.
Natalie
And
Yam also.
exactly. So this is the turn. Democratic countries adopting authoritarian practices is the trend of the day.
Hmm. I don't know if you're aware, CSFP 2025-966, also European Council Resolution CSFP 2025/966, which allows the European Council, not a court, to do exactly that, what they did with Jacques Beau and Nathalie Yam. They freeze all your assets, not only your assets, but also the assets of potentially also the assets of your family. They restrict your travel. You cannot do anything anymore, right? With the flip of a button. And now with digital IDs, with central bank digital currency, all coming in, these kind of measures will be easier and easier for unelected officials in Europe.
That is the key. Unelected officials. Um, if you are not elected, if you do not have popular sovereignty behind what you do, then you are a dictator. You are a tyrant. And I've had great difficulty understanding the British decision to leave the European Union. But it is exactly this kind of untrammeled bureaucratic uh, uh, misbehavior that angers people sufficiently to do something which I consider to have been stupid, namely Brexit, because that has greatly diminished the influence of Great Britain internationally and imperiled its future prosperity. Um, but I mean, I think it is true, generally speaking, that the rule of law which is closely related to democracy, although not identical to it, that the rule of law is intended to protect the weak against the strong. It's also intended to allow public discussion of policy issues. And it is intended to produce a predictable environment in which people can get on with their lives and businesses, uh, taking advantage of the fact that outrageous surprises are ruled out. But outrageous surprises are now the norm. And I think this is um, I think J.D. Vance and the document you referred to, the national strategy document, referred to civilizational erasure in Europe. And uh, my reaction to that is mirror imaging. Civilizational erasure is going on in the United States. It's also going on in Europe, I think. And our proudest achievements as the collective West, which are built on the European Enlightenment and its values, are all being hollowed out. Those achievements are disappearing. I think the world will be far worse off because of that.
You just said the well, I remember from one of the previous interviews that you had with me that you said diplomacy is dead, and now you just said something that undermines all the international institutions. And I have the latest presidential action, what's it called? Presidential memoranda, January 7th from Trump in front of me. The headline is withdrawing the United States from international organizations, conventions, and treaties that are contrary to the interests of the United States. Now, if you scroll through this, I mean, I can't even count how many organizations. I'm
I think
taking a
there
wild
are
guess.
31 UN agencies, I understand,
Yes.
and an almost equal number of non governmental organizations.
Yeah.
And this is self isolation. It is also repudiation of the principles on which the American Republic was founded. Um, if you recall, our Declaration of Independence opens with respect for the decent opinion of mankind. There is no such respect now for foreign opinion or for international law, or the UN Charter, for the norms of civilized behavior. And this is, again, to go back to the Donroe Doctrine idea, this is gangster logic, um, very familiar to the Cosa Nostra in Sicily, and now institutionalized in our governments. I mean, I am not, you mentioned the conceit that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, quote, unprovoked, unquote. Of course, it was not unprovoked. And it's very interesting to me looking at Venezuela. Uh, the argument has been made that, well, every country has the right to choose its own alliances and alignments without regard to their impact on their neighbors, meaning Ukraine can join NATO, even though that is a threat to Russia, because it would result in weaponry aimed at Russia being stationed in Ukraine on a permanent basis. And Venezuela makes it clear that that's absolute nonsense. Venezuela's alignment with countries that are not friendly to the United States, namely Russia, Iran, China, um, has resulted in its in a regime change attempt and an invasion. So, what is left of the condemnation of Russia for addressing a similar problem in Ukraine? The second point here is that if the United States, in fact, has reinvented the Monroe Doctrine in a particularly brutal fashion to establish a monopoly of influence in the entire Western Hemisphere, or a tyranny, if you will, because it is not based on any input from those affected by they are simply to have it imposed upon them by an arbitrary and capricious leader in North America, namely Donald Trump. If if this is all about spheres of influence, then let's look at Ukraine. Was Ukraine, were the Russians attempting to establish a sphere of influence in Ukraine? No. They agreed in the Minsk Accords that the Donbass region should be part of Ukraine, although it should enjoy cultural and linguistic autonomy. They did not try to dismember Ukraine. They did not insist on replacing the government in Kiev. They now do, of course, because of its orientation toward the memory of Stepan Bandera and Nazi elements. But this is all about spheres of influence. It was the United States and NATO that proposed to incorporate Ukraine into our sphere of influence, excluding the Russians. The nature of a sphere of influence is that it excludes other powers. So that was a provocation. And it isn't as though the Russians didn't warn NATO and the United States very clearly on multiple occasions, beginning in 1994 with a warning from Boris Yeltsin, continuing in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference when Vladimir Putin shocked everyone by warning that Russia would have to take military action if it was provoked. The reaction in 2008 to the American basically compelling Europeans to agree that Ukraine and Georgia should become part of NATO. Europeans very reluctant at that time, very sensibly. That was followed by a war with Georgia, which the Russians intended as a signal of their seriousness. And all of this culminated in December of 2021 with an ultimatum from the Russians. Either you neutralize Ukraine, return it to the neutrality, which was the basis for our recognition of its independence when the Soviet Union broke up. You restore the linguistic and cultural rights of its minorities, especially the Russian minority, which is 29% of the population. And you engage in a discussion with us of a modified European security architecture that can reassure us against Western attack, which is not irrational. After all, Russia has been invaded by both France and Germany in the last 2 centuries. Before that, by the Mongols from the east. The Russian mentality is very much defensive and a bit paranoid because of this history. Either you do these things, you neutralize Ukraine, you restore the rights of minorities, and you engage in a dialogue about a security framework which can reassure you as well as us, or we are going to take action. And
If we,
yeah, the
sorry,
response was, we will not talk to you. Therefore, they did take action. So this business about unprovoked is a nonsense, and the error is compounded by we can't talk to people who do things like the Russians. Therefore, there's no dialogue. This is again, Giorgia Meloni has apparently had the courage to question the idiocy of this stance and to argue that if you want to solve a problem involving the Russians, you have to talk to the Russians, and who have always been willing to talk. The business about bringing Russia to the negotiating table is complete nonsense. They've always been willing to negotiate. It's we who have been unwilling to negotiate. So I think in Europe, you have several things going on. There is the beginning of a serious reaction to the high handedness of the United States with a statement by Merz, of all people, and others, uh, four others, basically saying, look, you have to stop this nonsense or something's going to happen. So, there's discussion among Europeans. Should we get rid of the American bases in Europe? You can be very sure that if that idea is advanced, the Zionist lobby will immediately oppose it, because the primary function of those bases is to facilitate logistic support of Israeli genocide. And I understand that, in fact, Israel is gearing up to attack Iran again, probably in February. And we're seeing all of the indicators you would expect for that. First, a propaganda pretext for an attack. Netanyahu saying ridiculously, if Iran resumes its development and production of missiles, we will have to attack. Of course, Iran never halted its production of missiles or research on them. And so this is simply a statement that we intend to attack, and use that as an excuse. He has been very careful about Iran's nuclear program because, of course, Donald Trump claimed to have obliterated it. So he doesn't want to say, well, it still exists. But of course, it does exist, and he knows that. And so he says, well, if they resume their nuclear program, he and Donald Trump agree, Iran will have to be attacked. You have Donald Trump saying, with regard to protests and riots in Iran, which, by the way, are being manipulated by an intensive information war with anti-regime, anti-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, pro-American propaganda flooding into the country, and obviously agents of influence being energized to turn peaceful protests into violent riots. Um, these are all indications of intent. And then you have the transit of C5s through Europe in the direction of Israel. These are heavy lift transports. What are they transporting? Nothing that we should be happy about if we don't think there should be a war in the
There's a
Middle
whole
East.
fleet, sorry, there's a whole fleet of those airplanes in Great Britain. They're constantly coming and going, a whole fleet of them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, anyway, what I'm saying is um, those bases in Europe, the primary utility of them has been and remains Ramstein, for example, is
Exactly.
logistical support for um, interventions in West Asia. Uh,
Especially specifically with drones. All the drones are commanded from there.
yeah, well, that's right. So um, this is rather ominous. And, I have to I end by saying, as I will say tomorrow at the conference of the Schiller Institute, that I find it really anomalous, ironic, and strange that Europeans should be willing to entrust the future of European security, the resolution of the Ukraine war, to amateur cronies of Donald Trump, who regards the EU as a competitor and doesn't seem to have any interest in Europe except as a market for American weaponry. Why is Europe not taking this issue under its own wing? Um, these issues, I should say. And, do people in Europe really imagine that, as happened at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in which, by the way, Napoleon attacked Moscow, not the other way around, um, that, the addition to the French language of the word bistro, uh, Russian for fast, hurry it up, the treatment of restaurants in Paris as fast food joints by the Russian military when they occupied Paris at the end of the Napoleonic War. Do they really believe that this is either possible or the Russian ambition now? I just think um, we're living in an age of delusion, denial, and deception.
Hmm. Ambassador, since we spoke last, and it's about half a year ago, yeah. But since we spoke last, I started to investigate exactly what you just said, the European point of view in regards to the global situation and why Europe is so reluctant to even stand up to America or Trump. Yeah. And what I found, I published a number of papers on Medium in the meanwhile. And what I found was that, I mean, first of all, there were, till late 90s, there were NATO exercises which entailed the dropping of 300 nuclear bombs, not on Russia, but on West Europe. When I read this first, I couldn't believe it. So the then Chancellor, what was it, either Helmut Kohl or Schmidt, pulled out from the exercises because they were so alarmed, because the Americans already in this
Yeah.
exercise at day three, on day three already, they wanted to, I mean, in the exercise, yeah, to drop nuclear bombs on Europe. So what I found was, and that's my argument in my papers, that America was, and I run this by you as a question, yeah. So America was never, after the Second World War, never a true protector of Europe. America saw Europe as two things: as collateral damage, number one, and number two, as a shield, as a battlefield for their wars, so that they don't have to have them on American soil. And case in point, crystal clear case in point, is the war in Ukraine. Or do I make this too black and white?
Well, let me make two comments. First, with regard to bombing your own territory, NATO territory, NATO bombing itself, there is a precedent for this, which many people are unaware of. When the Chinese developed their nuclear weapons, their assumption was that the Soviet Union or the United States, but most likely the Soviet Union, was poised to invade them. That was in fact correct. And that therefore World War III would begin with an invasion of China. And therefore they targeted their own territory with their nuclear weapons. They did not target the Soviet Union. They assumed there would be troop concentrations and movements, um, nodes through which logistics flowed, which had to be destroyed. And so they used their short range missiles, which were nuclear armed at that time, were aimed at their own territory. So there's a precedent here. Now, in the case of Europe, I think there's a more fundamental strategic rationale for what you just described, which is that the principal interest of the United States with regard to Europe was to deny its resources to the Soviet Union. Well, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either prevent the Soviets from invading, which was obviously the preferable way to deal with this. We had the Marshall Plan and other mechanisms designed to buttress Europe against the Soviet attack or invasion. Um, and I'll make a comment about that in the end. But the uh, the other way, of course, is just to destroy the resources that the Soviet Union might otherwise obtain. And if you're a military person and you're thinking about how to mount a counterattack or a defense of territory in Western Europe when the Fulda Gap has been overrun, of course, you think about bombing whatever it is that the Soviets might have taken. So there's an explanation there. The other point I want to add, and I apologize if I've mentioned this before, but I was the synthesizer of what became the Partnership for Peace. And when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, I thought it could be one of two things. It could be the basis for a Europe-wide cooperative security system in which matters like Bosnia or Kosovo or whatever would be handled in a pan-European context, or it could be the basis for an expansion of NATO, if that proved necessary. In the end, it wasn't necessary, but the expansion of NATO politically became desirable for neoconservatives and old Cold Warriors who were disturbed by the outbreak of peace in Europe. So, in the middle of all this, as the Partnership for Peace was getting going, I held a meeting in Garmisch, which is where the Russian language school was for the American forces in NATO, with the Czechs, Hungarians, and Slovaks, that is, their defense establishments. And I remember very vividly the Czech, who had actually been to Ranger School at Fort Bragg in the United States, was very familiar with American military organization and thinking, a very Teutonic Slav, I should say, as the Czechs are. Um, we had a very good meeting in which I described to him what we had in mind. And after dinner that night, he said to me, "Would you like to take a walk in the town, Garmisch?" And I said, "Of course, that sounds like a good idea." And so at that time, I didn't have trouble walking, which I do now. We went up a hill in the town, and he started telling me, he said, "This is Heidi's dress shop, Heidi so-and-so's dress shop, and her husband, Hans, has a butcher shop over there." And we go up and down. And I said to him, "My goodness, you really know this place well. How often do you come here?" He said, "This is my first visit, but I was trained to occupy the place." And I subsequently had a meeting with the then national security establishment in Kiev. This would have been in early 1995 or end of 1994. And I remember asking the people I was talking to, uh, one of whom was an ex-Soviet paratrooper. I said, what was the happiest moment in your life?" He said, "When I went to Copenhagen." He said, "I spent 17 years practicing parachute drops on Copenhagen. I knew it like the back of my hand, but I had never been there. It's a wonderful place," he said. True. And the other thing that came to my mind, the national security advisor, I said, "What is your major challenge for national security?" He said, "Our troops are deployed on the wrong frontier. We need to move them east and north, and lean against Russia." And he said, "But of course, if we do that, this will result in an invasion of Ukraine." So they were not unrealistic. Um, they both said the major problem we have in terms of our military is that when we were part of the Red Army, we were never trained to defend anything, only to attack. And he said, so I should mention, when the Hungarian turned up, he spoke perfect Italian. Uh, he was going to occupy northern Italy. The Slovak, like the Czech, spoke excellent German because had been trained to occupy part of Germany. So the Cold War was not uh, as innocent on the Soviet side as many would like now to believe. Um, I think it was motivated on their part by the same thing that motivated us, the security dilemma. They feared what we were doing, just as we feared what they were doing. And this resulted in an arms race and escalating confrontation. But we should learn from this. We should not repeat it. We had a slogan, Europe whole and free. Good slogan. We should be working to create that. And that beginning of that is to recognize that Russia is part of Europe. You may not like that, but that is a fact. And if you exclude Russia or any other great power in Europe from participation in the management of European security, you cause chaos. That's what we did after World War I, excluded both Germany and Russia from any role in the management of European affairs. That led directly to World War II and the Cold War. So I thank Giorgia Meloni for finally saying something sensible. Um, and I hope that her common sense is contagious and that other European leaders who have said some mighty stupid things uh, learn from her.
Ambassador, with your kind permission, I have two small points still I would like to discuss. That not major, yeah. One more time, coming back to Greenland and Trump taking Greenland, yeah. So in your perspective, I mean, we can I believe we can safely assume that Trump is serious about that, right? So if he would take Greenland, and whatever take means, he said military or all at all means or something like that he said it. That would mean, and again we need to qualify attack, but that would mean basically one NATO country coerces, attacks, I don't know, invades another NATO country. So what would that mean for NATO?
Well, I think Prime Minister Frederickson is correct. It would mean the end of NATO. But uh, I have a question. Why doesn't she say if a country attacks part of Denmark, including Greenland, we will invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty?
Exactly.
She should say that. Then she should have the backing of other Europeans if she does. Um, I think there are there are several arguments in favor of the United States taking Greenland, which doesn't mean that I approve at all of that idea. But the first is that the United States is focused now on the Arctic and a contest with the Soviets, with the Russians, with the Chinese who are active in the Arctic. Of course, global warming has opened the passages through the Arctic to shipping and made it into a strategic communications corridor, which is of concern to the United States, Canada. And so that's the first argument that Greenland would facilitate a contest for control or management of Arctic transportation routes. The second, of course, is that Greenland is a very large island with a lot of rare earths and other useful materials. And then there's a third argument, which is geographic tidiness, which is not very persuasive, but Greenland is effectively part of the Western Hemisphere, as the Viking history of its settlement illustrates. So these are the arguments. I don't find them at all persuasive. I do think that there are ways in which this could be peacefully resolved, which might result in Greenland being incorporated into the United States somehow. Because it's quite evident that Greenlanders, there are only 57,000 of them, but Greenlanders would rather be independent. And if that's the case, and the Danes know that, Greenland is voluntarily associated with Denmark as a result of Danish colonialism. But that tie could be broken with a referendum, and if the United States were clever, if there were a referendum on Greenland's independence, we would offer to pay every Greenlander who voted for association with the United States a tidy sum of money. It wouldn't be very expensive because there are only 57,000 Greenlanders. So there could be a democratic solution, but that is not what is being proposed. What is being done is right out of the Mafia playbook. Um, nice island you have here, Denmark. Would be a shame if something happened to it. And of course, the main issue, as I said at the outset, is the implosion of the rules regulated international order and the suspension of all respect for the norms of international law. And that is a much bigger issue than Greenland and its rare earths or the future of its 57,000 people.
For my last element, we remain with the NATO. But before I come to my question, I'll read you a couple of statements, three statements. Yeah. On December 11th, NATO's new General Secretary Mark Rutte, who was was the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, where I'm living, said, "We are Russia's next target, and we are already in harm's way." That's number one. Then Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, England, Chief of Defence Staff, said, "We need to be ready to fight, and more families," I mean, you have to let this sink in, yeah? "More families will know what sacrifice for our nation means," meaning they have to sacrifice their children, right? And last but not least, the new MI6 chief Blair's Machiavelli, "The front line is everywhere, online, on our streets, in our supply chains, in the minds, and on the screens of our citizens. Keyword cognitive warfare in our minds." And now it comes. When we look at Venezuela and Greenland, NATO representatives are absent. There's no there's
Yes,
no
of
real
course.
comment. So
Yes,
you know,
yes, of course. Well, I have to say that Mark Rutte is a sycophantic idiot. Um, I don't know how he became the prime minister, but uh, he is toadying to Donald Trump.
you call him
Uh,
daddy.
and that is the main function. He sees his main function as holding the United States and NATO together. Well, that's entirely understandable, but it's a bit humiliating for him, I imagine, to have to do what he does. As far as the British are concerned, Russophobia has been a main feature of British policy since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. British policy toward Europe has always sought to divide Europe and to prevent a strong power from taking control of it. Crimean War cemented Russophobia. It has continued, never gone away. And so, but I would argue that the circumstances that produced it, namely a desire not to see Europe united and therefore independent of British influence, um, that these circumstances are gone. And here we go back to why NATO did not dissolve after the end of the Cold War. Obviously, one reason was lingering concern about Eastern Europe and Russia. But another one was that if the United States were not part of the European security arrangements, Germany would dominate Europe. Now Germany's rearming, and some people are concerned what this may mean again for Europe. When Germany united under Bismarck, it was a matter of, it changed the whole geopolitical equation for Europe. Ask the French about that. And now Germany is again rearming, and no one should, discount the ability of the Germans. They are very capable people, and they have been hiding behind their guilt over the Holocaust. But now I think they're emerging once again as an independent force. So I'd argue to the British, look, if you really ought to be thinking about Russia as a dilution of German domination of Europe, not the other way around. But who am I to make such arguments?
Fully agree. Last point, if you allow me. You will not have seen the movie. It's called Heads of State, but maybe your grandchildren have. If you have a chance to speak to them, ask them if they saw the movie, and if they did, if they noticed that NATO featured in this movie 27 times in the most glorious description. Yeah. So this
Oh,
is a
really?
propaganda movie. This is a propaganda movie, a state of the art. It's not even state of the art. It's so obvious. It's incredible. So just for fun,
So,
if your grandkids saw the movie,
yeah,
ask them if they
where is Leni Riefenstahl when we need her? And
exactly.
and
Hitler's Hitler's film director. Yes.
yeah, and I keep thinking, I really miss Charlie Chaplin. His film, The Great Dictator, is very, very relevant. And if only he were around, I think he would have great fun with what is happening in my country. I don't find it very entertaining, frankly.
It gets less and less so. Ambassador, anything before we conclude this interview? Anything that you would like to add that we did not scratch on?
No, I've said enough to get myself tarred, feathered, and run out of town on a pole. I'll leave it there.
Ambassador, I always enjoy talking to you. I thank you really for spending time with me on a Sunday. I wish you, what can I wish you, Ambassador? Peace, peace of mind, maybe.
I'll look for it.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, now I will stop, but please don't quit right away. The upload status is almost completed.